After auditing 300 plus podcasts, I've noticed that most podcasts set and forget their podcast show description, sabotaging their podcast growth and ability to attract new listeners and clients to their business. With show descriptions that are super boring, generic, and read like boring resumes, instead of a well-crafted, compelling invitation where we're trying to turn more strangers into active listeners of your podcast. Now, this happens because most podcasters are totally unaware that a podcast show description is one of the top things new listeners look at when deciding a new podcast to listen to. Hello, my name is Anthony Winery. I'm the co-founder of GetMoreListeners.com, a company helping experts and entrepreneurs grow profitable podcasts that builds their personal brand and attract dream clients to their business. Over the last 3.5 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters, published multiple best-selling books, and I'm the co-host of Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, which has generated $120,000 of additional profits in the last 9 months for our podcast. And today I'm going to share with you the exact framework that you can use to create a podcast show description that acts as a 24/7 sales agent, allowing you to turn more strangers into active listeners of your podcast. You'll also discover 3 common mistakes most podcasters make in their show description that repels new listeners, a simple 5-part framework for writing the perfect description, and finally, how to craft the right call to action in your description that gets a new listener instantly taking action and binging your content. Now, before we dive into these frameworks, I want to expose 3 costly mistakes that's most likely stopping you from turning more strangers into listeners of your podcast. So mistake number 1 is the feature focus fallacy. Like a restaurant menu that describes all of the ingredients without describing the experience, many podcasters focus on what their show includes rather than what it does for the actual listener. It's like trying to sell a vacation by listing flight times instead of painting a clear picture of the incredible experience awaiting for them. The outcome of this is you have a weak value proposition of why people should listen to your podcast, you have poor conversions from browsers to actual subscribers, and you're missing the emotional connection with your ideal clients. It's not just a plasterboard. You've got to remember, as just another person going onto your podcast description and reading it. So here's an example, right? We have a weak podcast description, whereas like our podcast features experts, industry news, and actionable marketing tips. In comparison to a much stronger show description, which could be struggling to get clients. This podcast gives you battle-tested marketing strategies used by top entrepreneurs, so you can attract high-paying customers without wasting time on tactics that don't work. You see, one is just talking about the features, right? Whereas the other one is speaking to the individual. Are you struggling with this problem so you can attract high-paying customers? Mistake number 2, everyone's welcome syndrome. This is my pet peeve, by the way. So what this looks like is a business podcast description that reads perfect for entrepreneurs, business owners, startup creators, corporate leaders, and anyone interested in success. For everyone, right? Looking at the analytics, they're completely puzzled as to why their show attracts lots of casual browsers and few serious clients. Now, why is this? Well, simply put, when your show description is trying to target absolutely everyone, like you just say, hey, this is for everyone within your industry, whether that's podcasting, whether that's in the fitness space, whether that's in the personal development space, if you say anyone who wants to get better, and it's super broad and generic, no one really feels connected. No one feels like your podcast was specifically made for them. Now, the outcome is you end up attracting the wrong audience. You have a diluted expert positioning. If it's for everyone, how can you be the go-to authority for a specific subject? And finally, it leads to weak client acquisition rates. Again, if your podcast is a billboard to attract the right listeners who can become clients for your podcast, and if your podcast description is targeting everyone and the right listeners come across your podcast description and they don't feel like it's relevant to them, their pain points and where they're at right now, they won't click and press play. And if you're not attracting more of the right listeners who can become clients, you might grow a podcast audience, but none of them are your ideal clients, which makes it impossible to monetize your podcast effectively. And then finally, the 3rd mistake, information overload blind spot, cramming every single topic, benefit, story, credibility in your description. This also includes adding multiple calls to action at the end of your episode and podcast description. Telling someone to follow you, buy your program, join your list when they've only just discovered you. Now, just imagine you go on your first date. Within 5 minutes, the other person tells you about the challenges, about all of their achievements, about their childhood trauma, and about all of the things that have gone through. How would that make you feel? Now, don't get me wrong, is it nice to hear about someone else? Yeah, of course. But let's be honest. Let's really be honest, right? We also like to talk about ourselves. And we're probably thinking, all right, this is great, but why the hell should I care? I've just met you. This means nothing to me. Thanks, I'm glad I know this information, but what the hell do I do with that? And then let's say they then go on to tell you all the reasons why you should marry them. Most likely be a little bit freaked out, a bit annoyed, and a bit pissed off that you've wasted your time on this first date. You never return their text, they're gonna get ghosted, and the reason is you've just met this person and they completely overwhelm you with just a bunch of information you don't really need to know about. Now, the exact same thing happens with your podcast description. When you try to cram in way too many benefits, when you try to cram in a massive long-ass story, when you try to cram in all of your expertise and all the amazing guests you've had onto the podcast, when you try to cram in all the CTAs possible, follow me on social media, listen to my podcast, go join my email list, join my newsletter, check out my YouTube video. Now, most people do this and make this mistake because they feel like the description is a place where they should share everything to build up massive credibility, to share as much as they possibly can. But that's not the right approach, because a person who's just discovering your podcast for the first time, they don't know, like, and trust you yet. They don't really care about your backstory. They're not going to follow you on Instagram or other social media platforms when they haven't even taken that first step to listen to your podcast. So it's not about sharing absolutely everything. It's about knowing what to share and sharing only the right thing for that person in that right moment in order to win them over, to get them to click play and listen. The same way when you're on a first time date, it's not about sharing everything about yourself. Some things you've got to keep mysterious, some things you've got to keep a secret, but it's about sharing the right things in the right order. So look, those are the mistakes that most podcasters make. But the question is, well, why does this happen in the first place? Why is it that so many podcasts have terrible show descriptions that does the opposite? That instead of attracting new listeners to their podcast, they're repelling new listeners to their show. Now, there's really two reasons. Number one, I'll be honest with you, I was completely shocked that people read podcast descriptions because I personally don't read podcast descriptions. But the same way that just because I'm not a vegan, it doesn't mean that other people aren't vegans. Or the same way that, love to have a cup of coffee in the morning, it doesn't mean that everyone else loves to have a cup of coffee in the morning. My point being, most podcasters set and forget the podcast show description simply because of the fact they're just unaware that as an area that they can optimize in order to improve the likelihood they turn a stranger into a listener. It seems like an area of the podcast where you just kind of, again, set and forget. And then the other reason is, even if people know that the podcast show description is an area they should focus on, you can have this long-ass, elaborate show description that doesn't speak to the right pain point, that doesn't speak to the right listener. And the reason it doesn't speak to the right pain point or the right listener and is unable to turn more strangers into listeners of the podcast is because the simple reason that most podcasters aren't very clear on who they're trying to target with their show. And this needs to be the starting point, because how are you going to present your podcast in the best way possible if you're unclear about who you should target with your podcast? So those are two things. Number one, they just aren't aware that the podcast description is an area to focus on, so they set and forget it. And number two, they aren't super clear on who they should target with their show. So when they come to write a podcast description, they just add all the wrong information rather than the right and relevant information that's going to target the specific listener they want to reach with their show. So look, right now, your podcast description can either be working for you or against you. It's either pulling in the right ideal listeners like a magnet, or is making them scroll past without a second thought. Now, if you look at your download numbers and they aren't growing, how important do you think it would be to get every advantage you can to improve all areas and aspects of your podcast that can influence a listener's decision to listen or skip? Now, the good news is fixing these problems, it doesn't require fancy copywriting skills or a total rebrand. It just takes a simple 5-step checklist that makes your podcast instantly more appealing and impossible to ignore. Number one, start with a hook question. Open your description with a question that resonates with your target audience. It should address their pain points, desired outcomes, or a specific thing your audience cares deeply about. This grabs their attention and immediately signals to the reader that they're in the right place. The point here is to clarify straight away who your show is for by painting a very clear picture of your ideal listeners. Use 1 or 2 sentences to describe the situation or mindset of your audience, making the content way more relatable. So here's a bad versus good example of a podcast description using a question hook. So a bad example is this one, right? It's a hook that's overloaded and super generic. It reads something like this. Welcome to the Business Growth Podcast, hosted by Anthony Winery, a 10-year experienced marketer veteran. This show features experts, interviews, case studies, personal stories, marketing tactics, and actionable advice for business owners, Follow us for new episodes every week. Join our email list and don't forget to check out our online course for more in-depth strategies. Now, why this fails is pretty simple, right? We have no hook and no direct engagement. It starts off super generic and in a forgetful way. It's way too focused on the actual host rather than the listener. This really isn't about you. It's about your audience. It's about the person you're trying to attract. It's about presenting your podcast in the best way possible to engage them. This has none of that. It has a list of features, expert interviews, case studies, personal stories, marketing tactics are just buzzwords. Those aren't benefits. It tells you what's included, but doesn't explain why someone should actually care. And then finally, you're overloading people with CTAs before they've even listened to your actual podcast, before they know your show is valuable to them. In comparison to a good example, struggling to grow your business with content marketing. Does every social media platform you try and tap into feel overwhelming? You're not alone. This podcast breaks down simple strategies that helps entrepreneurs build a YouTube channel that attracts more clients and builds authority in 10 minutes or less each day. Straight away, why does this work? Well, firstly, it starts off with a relatable question that speaks directly to the listener's needs. Are you struggling to grow your business with content marketing, right? It immediately reassures someone that they're in the right place. Hey, look, you're not alone, right? So they feel connected to you. And then you clearly outline the benefit, right? Proven strategies that solve real problems. There's no fluff, there's no distraction, and it is just such a clear value proposition within literally the first 3 sentences. When someone reads this, if they're the right avatar, they're going to keep reading and they're going to want to listen to your podcast. When you don't have that, your podcast gets ignored. Number 2, list the benefits. So clearly outline what listeners will gain from your podcast. Mention 3 very specific benefits or transformations they can expect to go through when listening to your podcast. Here's an example. In less than 10 minutes a day, get a specific action step to grow your YouTube audience. Finally, start posting simple videos that generate clients for your business even as a beginner, and save years of trial and error and shortcut your way to a 7-figure content-driven business. Again, 3 benefits and 3 very clear reasons why this person should listen to the podcast. Number 3, strategic mini story. Now, I really do mean this. Mini. It's got to be mini. So keep it short, keep it sweet. You don't want to just bore someone with your life story because, again, they quite frankly don't care. Now, what this will do is will add a personal touch that makes you way more relatable whilst also building your credibility. This does not need to be long. It can be short, concise, and sweet. Again, a mini strategic story. So here's what it will look like. After investing over 100,000 in online coaches and applying what I learned, I grew my channel past 100,000 subs and 7 figures in revenue in less than 12 months. That's the, again, story credibility. I realized there are only a few simple shifts every content-driven business needs to scale fast, but most content out there makes things sound complicated and overwhelming. That's why I created Profiting from YouTube Made Simple. Now, what have we done here? We've given a quick background of our story and our credibility. I invested X amount of dollars and I've learned this thing, finally had a breakthrough. I had this realization that things are complicated, and that's why I created this podcast, to make it easier for other people. It gives your podcast a reason why it exists. And again, it makes the person feel way more connected to you. That's all you need. That's literally all the story needs to be. Number 4, describe the format. Give practical details of your podcast. Mention the frequency of episodes, their length, and the actual format itself. Is it solo? Is it interview based? The section should also be used to highlight your unique selling point, your USP. Now imagine walking into a restaurant and asking what's on the menu, and the waiter just says food. The question is, would you stick around? Probably not. But if they said, look, we serve quick, delicious 30-minute meals made fresh daily. Now you have clarity, you know what you're getting and how long it will take. More likely to make a decision whether or not you, and if it sounds like something that you're looking for, you go in, you'll sit down, you'll enjoy your meal, right? Now, podcast works the exact same because you're giving people an expectation, right? If you tell listeners, hey, we have new 10-minute solo episodes twice a week, every Monday and Thursday, packed with actionable insights, they immediately know whether or not it fits into their routine. But if they don't have clarity, right? Many will just move on because, again, they're looking for something that's way more predictable. Now, studies on content management show that clear expectations increases the retention rate. So research from Wistia is simply a video hosting platform designed for business owners. It essentially allows you to upload and analyze videos. They found that videos with clear timeline indicators keep viewers engaged for longer because people know what they're committing to. The same applies to your podcast. Listeners are far more likely to hit play if they know exactly what to expect. And then finally, incentivize with a call to action. Now, most people at this point will just share a bunch of different links to their social media platforms, their YouTube channel, their email list, and their program. But we want to be way more strategic. We want to direct potential listeners to a specific fan favorite episode. Now, it's important to know, when I say fan favorite episode, I'm not just talking about the highest downloaded episode. I'm really talking specifically about your most popular episode that has the highest number of downloads with the highest retention time. And it really does need to be the highest retention time as well. Because let's say, for example, you have 2 podcast episodes. One has 1,000 downloads for the episode. That's great, amazing. It did really well, performed really well. But let's say it has a 50% retention time, meaning the majority of your listeners don't get to the halfway point of the episode. This is an indicator of the quality of the episode. It tells you that, yes, people love the topic, hence why they click and start listening, but somewhere along the lines, the episode didn't deliver the right amount of value to keep them listening. Meaning, although it's a popular episode, it doesn't mean it's a high-performing episode that's the best quality, that's your best content. Whereas if you had an episode that was 800 downloads for the episode and you had 100% retention time, meaning that 800 people click play and 800 people complete the episode, that's a much better indicator of quality. The reason why this is important is because you want the episode you recommend as a fan favorite to be the episode you know is the highest quality episode you have produced, meaning is the highest popularity and it has the highest retention time. Because if you're going to try to make a good first time impression for your audience, it's going to be important you direct them to an episode you know they'll absolutely love. And you don't do this by guessing, you do this by understanding which episode is the highest performing based on the engagement on the particular show. Now, when you do this, when you add a singular focused call to action showing your fan favorite episode, it does 3 things. Number 1, it removes decision fatigue for that potential listener. They've discovered your podcast, they love your show, they love your description, it's done its job. However, they're kind of like, well, what's my next step? Now, we like to think that people just go through your back catalog, either click on the first episode and binge their way up, which really doesn't happen, or they click on the most recent episode. But that's not the case. They'll go through all of your episodes and try to find one that's highly relevant to them right now. The issue is when they go through your entire back catalog, they can feel very overwhelmed. So when you direct them to a fan favorite episode, it makes that decision for them. Number 2, you're using social proof psychology in order to show them and give them a reason why they should listen to that episode. When you say fan favorite episode, it gives a listener permission to listen to that episode. It essentially directs them and says, hey, by the way, all of my other listeners have enjoyed this as a fan favorite. Everyone else loves this. And it plays on the social proof psychology that allows them and makes them feel like, oh, if everyone loves this, there's probably a reason why. So I should listen to this episode as well. And finally, when you give them this call to action, it's just such a simple first step for them to take, right? Such a simple first step for them to take to listen to just one episode as a fan favorite. It gets your foot in the door, and because you're being strategic about the episode you're recommending, when they click play and listen, they'll love it as well. And once you've got them listening to the first episode, they're far more likely to take the next step and listen to the second episode and the third, and then become a fan of your show. So once again, here's a 5-part framework. Number 1, start with a question hook. Number 2, list 3 benefits. Number 3, use a strategic mini story. Number 4, describe the show's format. Number 5, give a singular incentive-based call to action. Right, I'll see you in the next video.